Hi. Welcome to the Designer Series, where you have a seat at the table. If you haven't been to Naval X Alexandria, then you might not be familiar with the workshop, where we come in and we actually do like welding and workshop types of things here. This is part of the Building Momentum space that is used for team building and activity like that. One of the lovely things about having this partnership with Naval X is being able to have access to all of their lovely resources, including my guest who's sitting next to me, Commander Michael Pine, who will be joining us here for this conversation. So while the last session was awesome, and I am not a cyber expert, our next and final talk is going to be in a completely different conversation. We're going to be talking into the challenging area of model-based engineering. Today's topic is the intersection of models and simulation to advance rapid innovation and acquisition, and that's a mouthful. That's a lot. We want to get into what we need to actually do to take all the theory and actually do something with it. Joining us in Zoom, we're hoping that this all turns out well. Do I have both my guests? Oh, awesome. Yay! We have Mr. Shannon Settles, who is the deputy for PEIWSC. If you were watching the main live show, you've heard us introduce him earlier today. And he is in charge of model-based systems engineering over at IWS. I will give each of our guests a minute to talk in a second. And we may also be being joined by Ms. Tamara Kick, one of the ONR science advisors, so hopefully she'll be able to join us as well today. The first thing I want to do is give you guys a chance to say hello to the watchers and the viewers. Do you mind if I start with my virtual here?
No problem at all.
Awesome. So Shannon, if you'll introduce yourself and tell us why you care about this particular topic. What does acquisition and models mean to you? Do we have audio for you? Oh, there we go. That's lovely.
You got me now?
I got you now, sir.
Good.
All right.
Good. Hey, thanks, Nicole. I read you loud and clear. I really appreciate the opportunity to kind of speak again. Just from a standpoint of what does, where does our IWSC interest lie with respect to models, and the model-based approach really comes down to, really from my perspective, the system of systems engineering and the complexity that is driven by our systems, and then when we interconnect them together, and how do we get our hands around that? What does it really mean? How do we assess and understand how effective our system of systems is? Now, of course, there's all kinds of modeling for all kinds of different purposes. We don't want to just model for model's sake, but we are good systems engineers. We always like to use the tools and capabilities that will allow us to be that much better and raise our game. And I think the model-based system engineering focus that I know this PEO has is just it's refreshing to me as I come in here and get to partner with the rest of the PEO to figure out how to do it and do it better. And I think the track that we're talking about in track 3 really will allow us opportunity to highlight maybe some different thoughts from our community, as well as some knowledge and learning that maybe we can take on board and become more effective. So that's really where our interest lies here. Thank you.
So do you have any people in IWS starting off acquisition work using models? I mean, are they using it in that realm for you guys?
There is, and that's one of the things that I come on board a couple of months ago. One of the questions as we start thinking about an IWS MBSE strategy, what does that look like? Is it even really needed? I mean, what does that mean? And I think first we have to take a step back and go, okay, who's doing what? And I think we've had some investigation along those lines and find out, hey, there's pockets of excellence, even within the PEO as well as NAVSEA, employing models-based systems engineering and doing it effectively. And there's an opportunity to to share what they have learned as they've taken it on to maybe some other parts of the organization who might struggle or just don't know where to start. So yes, to answer your question, there are entities, organizations who are doing it and doing it well.
All right, I believe we have Ms. Tamara Kick on the phone with us today. Tamara, can you hear? I know you go by Tammy. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
I can. Awesome. So can you tell us a little bit about what you do with ONR and your interest in the models conversation, the modeling conversation?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. As Nicole mentioned, my name is Tammy Kick, and I am currently the ONR Global Science Advisor to U.S. Fleet Forces. And in that role, I do two major things. I help project the fleet requirements back to the S&T community to help shape and influence the investments that they make in S&T towards to align with fleet requirements. And then I also work from ONR to make sure that maturing technologies are incorporated into fleet experimentation. So it's that point where I think that the modeling and simulation is able to help demonstrate to the fleet the capabilities that are coming up through acquisition and the S&T community. And here's where I'd like to introduce the concept that M&S can be done at many, many multiple levels. I think that's the beauty of MBSE. But, the actual development of the tools is one level, but how the fleet is able to employ new technologies to meet mission requirements is a different level of M&S. And so from that perspective is where I'm looking at fleet engagements and fleet missions and the different technologies that we're able to incorporate those through an M&S process.
Awesome. So one of the things I wanted to do is also introduce Commander Michael Pine, who I have next to me, who is a digital lead here at NavalX, but is also attached to ASN-RDA, if that's correct?
NavalX is aligned to ASN-RDA,
okay, got it. All right.
But I'm actually on detail from OpNav N1, which is the MyNavy HR enterprise.
Okay. And can you tell me, when we talked about this, you were interested in this conversation. Where's your interest in models and this conversation lie?
Well, it actually, in many ways, it stems back from my entry into the Navy. So as you can tell from being on detail from my Navy HR, I'm an HR officer now. Have a computer science major, and the computer science community has long been a believer in not what they would say modeling and simulation, but if you look at DevSecOps, if you look at DevOps, and even build pipelines and stuff, a lot of those things are based around how can we identify defects, how can we identify functional security flaws before they make it into production. So they're really building a model of their eventual production system. But even before computer science, even before cyber, I was in submarines, and submarine is very much the same thing. Is how can you forecast the future performance of a nuclear propulsion plant without actually having to put a nuclear propulsion plant into that situation or into that condition? Because if it goes bad, it's nuclear, right? And there's obvious flaws with that. And even if the nuclear reactor is not operating, we deal in things that are like high energy situations, whether that's air, water,
Yep.
high temperature fluids, and so we have piping tabs. We have things that we use to help us predict that tag outs will keep our sailors safe when they're doing maintenance, and that goes back to modeling and simulation. And even during a stint at the War College, where wargaming was a very large part of their curriculum, and for good reason. We used wargaming even before World War II to help us win the war in the Pacific, because it helped us forecast. If we had carriers that could do this, would that help the situation? Yep. Would that not change the situation? Would that hurt the situation? Without again having to put aviators into the air, having to build the carriers first, that kind of thing. And that helped us inform our planning for the future fleet design for what ultimately ended up being the ships that won the war.
Excellent. So, each of you have talked about it from a different aspect, and they all, in some way, tie together, right? There's a thread there. So I want to talk about some of the components of this that are going to make it work. So I have a few questions that we thought of ahead of time. First of all, we talked about models, we talked about simulation. where's a priority? We can't, if I was in the workforce and I get said, oh, you're supposed to be doing modeling and simulation, what do I focus on first? Am I focusing on my models? Am I focusing on getting that part right in the data? Should I be worried about simulation so I can test the model? Like, how do I prioritize where I put in my efforts? Any thoughts on that? And any of you may speak.
So I'll go first, that's all right.
Sure.
So I've always been kind of a, put the end in mind. And, a lot of the training we do at NavalX also reinforces that. So, have a problem in mind, have the why in mind, understand what is the job to be done. However you phrase it, just like you said earlier, you're not building models for the sake of models. You're building models to help you do something or to help inform a hard decision that would cost a lot more money or a lot more time or put humans at risk if you tried to perform that decision using an operational scenario instead of a modeling and simulation scenario. So I think you think backward from that scenario, right? What is the scenario you're trying to avoid, or what is the scenario that is too expensive for you to be able to run multiple duplicates? Then figure out, can I simulate that? And if I would simulate that, how? And then kind of backwards from there into, okay, how can I model that? Another thing we teach in NavalX is lean startup types of practices, and lean descends from the Toyota production system, tied to the software development sector, and that was it's a huge point of emphasis among the Toyota production system is don't weld if you can kind of bolt things together. Don't bolt things together if you can tape things together. Figure out if there's some there before you go and bring your welders, because they're expensive, right? So that's my take on it, is figure out what scenario you're trying to avoid, and then if you can simulate it, and then if you can model it.
Okay, so order of events, what's the problem, then simulation, then modeling. Okay, any thoughts, Shannon or Tammy, on that?
Hey, Nicole. I guess one thing to add, I'm in full agreement with what the commander described. I think, it's always important to understand the purpose for why you're employing these processes and tools and so forth. So, there's a reason, and being thoughtful about what that problem is mandatory. So, I'm a firm believer in well thought out problem, attack, and I think this is good systems engineering, right? We're just using models to help us manage and address the complexity. So I've looked at the architecture. The modeling investment is really where we end up starting, but it's not an all or nothing, right? It really depends on how you're attacking the problem, what the problem is, and I think that really dictates to what the priority is, because it probably changes as you move through the development cycle. Over.
Well, that's what I was going to say. I was going to say, well, whose problem are you modeling, right? Because and depending on what seat you're sitting in, you might be thinking, well, I need to be modeling the fleet problem, or I need to be modeling the integrated problem, like the system-to-system problem, or I need to be modeling maybe a particular process problem that is going to happen in a workflow. And then how are you attaching that? Or, whose problem is it that you need to actually be representing in the moment, or in what you're trying to develop? I think that's probably a key question to figure out, I would imagine. Tammy, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm thinking out loud here, but I'm wondering if the modeling sim that gets done at the development level, if there's any ability to port that up to the fleet when they're doing their experimentation, kind of killing two birds with one stone. No need to model something twice. But I guess that would depend entirely on the fidelity and the, like the commander said, the intent of why you're developing the tool, and how that can be. I'm just thinking the multi-levels of M&S.
Yeah, Shannon, is that something that's realistic at a program office level, that you could have that kind of flow back and forth?
Yeah, I think we have to attack that problem, right? That's where our bang for the buck, I think, really occurs. It's when we learn how to invest in a model and reuse it for multiple situations, multiple needs. And I think there's examples of where that's happening, right? Of course, not every model is going to meet every need or be transferable to that situation. As Tammy mentioned, there might be a level of detail that may be needed, or lack of detail. We may have too much in one side or the other. That just has to be worked through and understanding. But I think there's opportunities to determine where we can make those connections and reuse, or we all use the one source model to accomplish the problem that we're trying to address.
So one thing I want to say to those who are listening, wherever you are, there's a Slido, a little QR code on the left there, and there's a link that's also on the site where we're doing the live stream. Please join in the conversation. I can see here, and I have a moderator who's managing, and we can see your questions. We want to definitely be able to tee those up. We have a couple more that I already have here, but I want to make sure that we're engaging the audience as well. So just a reminder to jump into the conversation. One of the things I wanted to touch back on, and I don't know from a NableX perspective if you guys talk about this, but you mentioned having the right level of detail going back and forth. There's an infrastructure issue here, right? Like how are we looking at how the Navy, I suppose, needs to look at infrastructure and tooling so that you can push the right models or the right data sets where they need to go and in the right places? Because if you're on the fleet side of it, if you're on the RDT&E or S&T side, your networks and where you're able to access data is different than if you're sitting at the yard, or if you're sitting at a lab or at a warfare center, or even at NableX. And have you heard any, or you have any thoughts about that discussion at all from your side? Because you guys talk a lot of innovators, in this space. Any thoughts about like the infrastructure and tooling piece?
Yeah, I think the infrastructure piece is actually one of those things that it never sounds important until you're actually trying to end up doing R&D, or you're trying to do innovation discovery, and you find you're kind of having to reinvent everything from first principles. And you think, wow, like I feel like I should not be the first one thinking about how do I set up a test stand for X, or how do I set up a simulation scaffold for Y? And usually you're not. And in fact, you're just rebuilding something that's been built before. And so that leads to the situation where people quite charitably are like, okay, let me build the one infrastructure for everybody, and sometimes they find that no one uses that infrastructure once they build it, because they've not actually figured out what are the needs for an R&D community or for a prototype shop. So it's like you got to kind of have it both ways there, which is you want the results of your prototyping, simulation, analysis, the test stand you build, whatever it is, to end up being reused, right? So the next innovator down the line has that available and finds that it's useful because it was used by an innovator. And then, as enough innovators have kind of built this into like, this is the way things should be done, now you start saying, okay, how do we take that, right? This thing which is kind of, I don't want to say COTS, right? But like we've commoditized it a little bit, and then use that as the base to do bigger acquisitions for other, research labs, other innovation shops, and start evangelizing these as best practices. So the next person down the line, they're not just thinking like there should be a better way to do this, but they know the terms, they know the terminology, they know the do's, they know the don'ts. So very important, but I would also just say keep in mind, like anything else, it's a thing to build, and the thing that you're building, you need to know that the users are actually going to use it. So don't forget the usability, don't forget to prove that there's product market fit, which is something that we also try to teach here at NableX.
All right. Those sound like sound principles to me. Tammy or Shannon, do you have any thoughts on that, or are you seeing any of that from your perspectives where you're at? Oh, I'm not sure if I lost anyone. Okay. Well, I think.
Hey, Nicole. Just from my perspective, I have we've made some progress in that area, right? It's definitely, as the commander alluded to, it's important, and we feel the pain of lack of infrastructure. I think probably a lot more than we should, and our team has to deal with that. but I have seen, I think over the recent, year, months, that our organization is making strides in that particular area to try to take it head on. Not solve the problem yet, but I think we're starting to see some fruit of their labor.
I know Admiral Kano has been talking with Admiral Wynn in NAVSEA-03 about this very topic from the NAVSEA perspective, to get after some infrastructure type of conversations there, which is great for the NAVSEA portion of it. Tammy, I'm interested, on the Fleet Forces side, do you see a demand signal, or is there a conversation that happens on their end about integrating, as you were saying, like the S&T community and an infrastructure that allows the Fleet Forces side to tie in more integrally from the beginning or earlier in the life cycle?
We are trying more and more to project the fleet requirements back towards not only the program offices and the Office of Naval Research, but also towards the innovators and the scientists and engineers. Because if we can influence the science and technology that they're developing at an early stage towards actual fleet requirements and give them that fidelity early and upfront, then yeah, I think that does facilitate some of that conversation and make it early adopters at the fleet level to be able to take some of that technology sooner than later, especially if they're directly solving, high important problem. But then you're right that the infrastructure becomes more complicated at that point. A lot of things are done in a more closed environment rather than out in the open space where innovators often live. So we need to figure out that translation between different nets and different levels of security. Yeah, it's tough. It's a tough problem to figure out. But I think they are looking at more ways to incorporate, the live virtual constructive into more parts of what the Navy does in the acquisition cycle.
Okay. We do have a question from our Slido, and it's the first one that we got in, and they're asking what sort of artifacts or tools are useful, particularly at various levels of abstraction. I'm not a modeler, so I'm not going to pretend that I am, but I would say that knowing that there are different types of models, for like your Cameo sort of 3D CAD model or 2D CAD models and things like that, and then your mathematical MATLAB models, and then the ones that I'm familiar with that look like things that you can actually touch. I don't know how you would do it. I don't know how you do abstraction with that, so maybe you guys have a little bit more insight into that. But this question is, what sort of artifacts and tools are useful? I would imagine it's different for each community. So let me ask Shannon first. Like, what do you, when you hear that question, what sort of artifacts and tools are useful for your level of abstraction? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, it's it's an unsatisfying answer, right? It's it depends. Really depends on the problem and how you're trying to tackle, right? And what are you trying to articulate or communicate? What answers are you trying to arrive at? I view it as what are the tools in your toolbox that will help you get the job done, and those vary, right? And we have just within PEIWS we have over 150 program/projects that are current right now. There's not one size fits all to answer the question, right? The engineering processes that are in different maturity states. They're from conceptual to delivery to operations and sustainment. There's system engineering questions being asked all the time. So depending on what the problem they're trying to solve is, it's really which tools that they use, as well as what level of information they're trying to actually model and communicate over.
Okay. I will say that he gave a couple examples in terms of like an N2 chart that you can Google on Wikipedia, that type of thing, swim lane diagrams, things like that. And I think that, I mean, those are all things I'm familiar with. I've never thought of them as models before, so that's an interesting way of approaching that. Commander or Tammy, do you guys have any thoughts on the idea, on the question, what sort of artifacts? Artifacts is an interesting term to use there for me, but what sort of artifacts or tools that are useful?
I have some, but I'd defer to Tammy if she has any.
As you're developing a technology, whatever it is, you may be going through an iterative development cycle and have some ultimate threshold and objectives that you're trying to get to, like so far of a range, be it a communication system or a propulsion system or speed, depending on what type of technology we're talking about. So if the developmental tools are able to spit out a minimum system performance kind of log sheet, then that may be helpful to port over into operational scenario type M&S tools. Getting your communication range covered, maps and graphics. So those kind of tools are helpful, but I think it's going to be tough to translate the developmental tools to operational tools.
I also think this is actually what we're doing in track 3. Like we're challenging the challengers with a very similar set of questions, because we didn't tell them like, hey, here's a limit on the models we're asking for here. We gave them some broad sort of directions and limitations on the scenarios to push this envelope, because as Michael Patrick, who asked the question, you're hearing, it depends is really, it sounds like it's the real answer here, is it really depends, and it depends on, I guess, where your skill set lies, right? Like
That's also what works. So, to build on Shannon's, with another, kind of weasel word style answer is like, does it work or does it not work? Because if it works, it's that old Marine thing, right? If it's silly but it works, it's not silly. Likewise for modeling and simulation. So it's, does it help you answer the question better? Does it help you inform that decision better than building the thing? And if it did, that's great. And so, I've seen all sorts of things have worked, like the digital twins, like BO IWS is doing a lot of great work at the Forge, just try to, virtualize some surface combat systems so that, you don't have to build Aegis ashore, you don't have to, go out to a ship and cut metal to install new server hardware to say, what would this do to that ship if I can extend the range out? Or if I can use this version of the radar instead of that version of the radar? Or if I can do illumination and targeting at the same time? So like the virtual twin would be kind of the artifact, that'd be the tool. But even thinking strategically, like I've seen things like Wardley maps, I've seen things like mission model canvases or business model canvases or value proposition canvases, like all sorts of things used to very good effect as long as it's helping you inform your decision. If you want to bring numbers into it, like I'm a big fan of Doug Hubbard's work in trying to quantify things in risk management, cybersecurity, that kind of thing, which you don't have to run statistical models first. You can start from what's your expert opinion on the odds of this happening next week, and they'll go, between 10 and 20%, or between 10 and 90% chance it'll happen. Those are very different answers, but they're both data, right? Data which you can then say, this is how much I would be willing to spend to neck that confidence interval down. Okay. And then even all the way down to just the source code. Like if I make this algorithm run in half the time, what does that do to the overall system of systems that we have? And then you run that in a CI/CD pipeline or a build pipeline just a million times in the cloud with the different variants, the different build matrices, and see what you get. Those are all useful tools. There's many more out there.
So hearing that answer and what you all have said leads actually, it's like he's a straight man for my questions here, at least directly to the next question, because if you're going to have that many models and that many different types of tools and constructs available, there's got to be something that's standard to tie it together, right? Because if we're going to have an integrated system, pieces have to talk to each other, and we all have to be able to interpret them. So, to my knowledge, we don't currently have a standard set of, we don't have a Navy-wide set of standards for model-based. If you were asked to point to one, do you think you know of one, or do you think that it's important enough to develop? Or maybe not.
Yeah.
Hey, Nicole, I can answer. I think there's goodness in it, right? This is this walking the balance of being overly prescriptive and tying people's hands, and also allowing us to be interconnected, right? To be interoperable with our models. I think that's the balance I know that we've tried to walk in the PEO, and we view it here at PEO IWS as, hey, it doesn't help us in our MBSC work if we are very insular in how we try to attack the problem. We have to be coordinated across NAVC and even broader, right? I mean, so yeah, there's goodness to help us get on the same page. I don't think there's at least Navy standards to that effect out there. I know IWS has just recently taken on some things to try to get us aligned in how we model, right? I mean, like we have an MBSC style guide that was coordinated with NAVC 05 and actually come out of the IWSC office here. There's opportunities like that, but I think those are just very initial type steps to get us moving in that direction. So I think it's critical over the next period of time, near term, to think through this as a Navy community, DoD community, of what does this look like, and how do we walk that balance of encouraging interconnectivity between our modeling and to be able to get that system of systems views and capability assessments, and not being so prescriptive that we limit ourselves over.
No, that's great. I think that's good.
Yeah, I love that answer because, again, as I had mentioned earlier, sometimes you kind of come to the solution too early in the process, and then you foist it on people instead of letting people discover that the solution meets their needs. So there's a fine balance to be had there. But I also think typically, there's always a not invented here syndrome thing that happens among any group of inventors. But like typically, communities tend to evolve onto things. No one wants to be different than the next team for no good reason. And especially like in the public service where you're not necessarily trying to capture rents or kind of force customers to use your thing, but by locking them in. I feel like standards typically get picked up when they make sense, and people sort of evolve toward that kind of common consensus or multiple consensuses. And having 2 or 3 standards is bad compared to having just the one that everyone knows. But it's also much better than having 20 different standards. And so it's like sometimes you got to pick your poison too, right? I would say, going back to that level of granularity exercise, if you're talking like really detailed models, sometimes it's just going to be like, what is the source code to your thing, right? And that's the standard. Going up to one level, enterprise architecture, it can be as simple as boxes and lines. If it's something you want to be able to look at and inspect. You also see standards out there like UML, which, while not necessarily very popular for software development at the technical level, can be very, very useful for comparing, systems within a system of systems. You also see things like, BPML for that. And you also see things for like when you want to have models that run in a simulator, going back to like which simulator you're using again, things like SysML. And SysML is not the only standard by any stretch either, but if you have a simulator in mind that will give you like, this model, this was the average queue length, this was the 3 sigma confidence interval to the amount of variance, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like if you have a simulator like that and you can build your model in an acceptable format, that's probably the format you should pick. Going back to my experience with OpNav N1, MyNavy HR, one of the things we were interested in for model-based systems engineering was how would it help us train sailors in advance of this new gear being designed, built, shipped out to the fleet. Because typically, new gear gets designed, built, shipped out to the fleet, and then you train the sailor. And so the training always lagged the introduction of the new gear. We wanted to make that training happen on time and even earlier by actually using like the 3D models that were in the model-based system engineering system. Or the PLM, as the case happened to be. And as it turns out, there's standards for all sorts of those things. And so if you want your model that you're building to be easily portable into a later training solution, there's standards you should pick for that as well. But it all goes back to it depends, because it depends on what you're trying to do with your model.
So that brings me to my last question, and I think it actually touches into Tammy's area quite well, because the users of the models are not always going to be engineers, right? They're not always going to be sitting in that seat. And we talk about the acquisition community. We want to be able to do acquisitions using models, to start and compete work. If I'm a trained acquisition analyst, I probably don't know how to read a model. I probably don't know how to put that in through my normal contracting cycle and the things I used to do in paper, right? I used to get a 10,000 page thing that described the thing, and I'd send that out and I'd get 20,000 pages back, and that would describe what they were going to do for you, and you'd read it. And now we're talking about doing this in a model. How do I manage that? How do I know how to use these things that you're developing that are going to make things faster and better for all of these, for the internal workings? But I'm sitting on the other end, whether I'm coming from Fleet Forces for the requirements, or I'm an acquisition side trying to help you get the thing purchased and built. How do we take this and give them what they need as well? Or do we design the model for them, or is that a different approach?
I'll start off this time again, and I guess I would say the thing for acquisition is it's always nicer for them to kind of have clear requirements. Especially coming out of an R&D phase, they kind of go, okay, it's great that you did discovery, but what do you actually want? And so like their acquisition process is going to be designed to say, I gave you what you actually wanted in the requirements you expressed to me. So kind of my dream is to eventually get to a type of model where, like, as an acquisition program manager, you can go and say, here's the 8 requirements that were deemed, like just absolute must-haves, and here are like the kind of between nice to have and absolutely must have, here's the gradations within those requirements instead of having them be binary. And now the requirement shop is also going to include a model that says, based on how you were able to successfully accomplish these requirements, here's, green light, red light, some numerical index in between. And that way an acquisition program manager can actually start being able to say, well, I can't achieve this weight threshold, but I'm going to get really close. But maybe I can make up for it and still, allow the requirement or the mission owner, to meet their mission by doing really well on some of these other factors, which is, decisions that, you could have certainly asked the question before, but it was always a science project. Like, hey, I can't meet weight. What if I do the X, Y, and Z? And they'll go, hold on, let me get back to you. Run the gonculator. It would be very nice for the acquisition program manager to be able to have the gonculator with them to say, here's the reality of life as it stands now. I can invest this much more money in, making these trade-offs. Which trade-off should I go after next? And that'd be really cool.
All right. So I'm going to go to Tammy now and say, with that thought in mind, what do you see the benefits on your side of the, for who you represent and you're working with on your side of the fence? With that same question, is there a different model set for them? Is there a different interaction on the Fleet Forces side?
Well, absolutely, especially if we're talking about a new capability, something revolutionary that the fleet has not experimented with. You're going to have to go through a certain amount of, breaking away from their traditional training rigor and try something new in a new way. And that does require, all the levels of training, a computer-based tabletop exercise all the way through fleet experimentation and then full TTP and CONOP incorporation. So, I think modeling and simulation can help at each of those levels. And there are trade-offs. There are absolute trade-offs that can be made as you're getting familiar with a new capability and a new way of using that new capability. So, yeah, I mean, I like the idea of the style guide versus prescriptive doctrine or prescriptive. Sorry, based on what word I was going for.
Standards.
What's I was going to say,
Yeah,
Shannon.
standards, absolutely. Standards are better.
So Shannon, to her point, I mean, you guys have a style guide, and you have 11 major programs that are doing different things. Are you seeing a lot of similarities in what they're doing, or a really good variety of actions that tie back, that they're also using the same style guide?
I think that right now we're still variety. We're still in the very elementary stages of the style guide just coming out, people becoming familiar with it. I think a lot of our interaction with the teams are, hey, I'm aware of it. I participated in the group that helped inform it. And there's nothing revolutionary here, right? It's hey, good practices. It's use SysML for what we're trying to take on, things like that. And then there's parties within our organization that goes, oh, I didn't realize we even had a style guide. So these conversations centering around MBSC and how we try to work together to get some similarities in our models enough where we can be interconnected. I think it's just an opportunity to mature within the organization. Like I said, we're at the early stages of it, and there's a lot of great work. Like some of the program offices I've seen are miles ahead, and they're fast running with MBSC and model down to they're executing milestone reviews with their models. That's a different paradigm than what we've seen over the 20 plus years I've worked in government, where you're passing documents back and forth. You have an industry and a government team that are actually working within the model to fulfill the entrance exit criteria for a major milestone. That's impressive. I think sharing that kind of knowledge across our command, hey, that's great. We're making strides in those areas, and we'll just continue to press and gain knowledge like we're having from this event.
So I was going to say, what I'm hearing out of this conversation, we've got about 10 more minutes, and then we'll be having a wrap. But what I'm hearing out of this conversation is some good challenges, like for CNR and leaders to take on how to integrate the needs of these various communities, right? So we've got a lot of opportunity and different types of models and tools and infrastructure we can put together, but really identifying, as you said from the beginning, identifying the problem set up front. What is it that Fleet Forces needs? What is it that the acquisition community needs, so that as the programs and the S&T community are building the things, they're able to meet those needs from the start, instead of being tasked afterwards and saying, hey, you didn't give me enough information, you didn't give me the thing I needed, or you end up doing double work, right? You end up writing a document anyway, even though you had a model or you had an alternative solution, because we didn't know what somebody else would need. And I will say that I've had the privilege of sitting at IWS and sitting in a couple places now CO3, and I've not seen yet that we've gotten that conversation started at a global level enough to start going after that. Like, what does that mean, right? What does that mean for each community? And I think this is a great start to that, but we probably need to continue it. So one of the questions that I'm seeing here from out external, and this is a good one, is, so they're coming into this cold, right? The communities that want to help us, external to us, are coming into this cold. There's a lot of Navy lexicons and ontologies, typologies, taxonomies, controlled vocabularies, glossaries, etc. What's available to them to help, right? What is out there that's available? And I don't know the answer to that. Do you guys have any knowledge based on that? Or like, what would be available for somebody who's not in the Navy to be able to start helping come up with solutions?
This is actually, probably an area near and dear to our heart at NavalX, is trying to help make it easier for the private sector or for people with like no defense affiliation whatsoever to be able to like meaningfully help DoD, DON with our defense-related problems. Because I mean, sometimes it's literally as simple as, you know, the DoD has asked for a custom requirement, and then 20 years, 30 years, 40 years goes by, and we go, you know what, it'd be really neat if we had it this way instead. And they go, oh, I'll do you one better. I just won't implement your custom requirement, because we were doing it that way the whole time before you had asked us to customize it. And that stuff happens. And so, like, you know, there's a lot of innovation out there in the commercial space that we would like to get into the Navy. So to try to, you know, more directly answer that question, you know, like we have a Tech Bridge network, which is kind of, you know, the first step I would recommend to anyone, you know, who's not a part of the defense marketplace already. If you're interested in learning more about, you know, the Navy lexicon, you know, what's important to the Navy, what's not important to the Navy, because like Tech Bridge is kind of like your entry point into not only the Naval X network, but also the wider community of the Naval Warfare Centers, which are doing R&D, you know, the various systems commands out there who are responsible for, you know, surface platforms, aviation platforms, information networks, that kind of thing. And you know, it's almost the easiest way to learn is by actually talking to people and be like, hey, what are your problems? And then you'll, you know, jargon draft, you know, what are you talking about? You know, what is an ICD? And you go, oh, I'm sorry, you know, I'm speaking in symbols, and explain that definition. And that's going to happen a lot, but I mean, that's the quickest way to do it. One thing we are doing is trying to come up with kind of curated problem definitions that we can give to industry that are unclassified. You know, it can be public, but you know, if industry like can bring us solutions to those, you know, they know it would be meaningful to us, and it's not just going to be like, oh, we solved that 20 years ago, or that's cute, but that's not interesting to our problems here. And within the Tech Bridge network, you know, we also have I want to say like a list of acronyms and stuff like that, which you can find everywhere. But the list of acronyms thing is pretty dry though. So like I recommend people talk to people. Tech Bridge is a good way to start talking to people.
I was going to say, you know, acronyms get you so far, that lexicon, but the question of ontologies, typologies, and those taxonomies, that's a very specific deliverable set there. Tammy, on the Fleet Forces side, do you have, I mean, internal to the Navy, do we have those repositories? Would we have something that that is shareable, that can help those communities start to help us?
Ooh, not that I've seen. I'm trying to rack my brain whether I've seen anything at O&R. I know that there's some commercial or academic resources, like the Robotics Institute at Carnegie Mellon had been putting together some standardization, data protocols, those sort of things. But those were mostly for unmanned ground vehicles, not necessarily the entire spectrum of unmanned systems.
I mean, honestly, and Shannon, you know, you could, as I say, I mean, Tammy, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I honestly sounds like this might be somewhere where we could use help, right? Like helping to develop some of these things that maybe we don't have yet.
I would amplify that a little bit. You know, like there are Navy small business innovation research pages out there as well. So it's not just a Naval X play. There's SBIR pages, there's STCR pages, and those are like oriented toward people who are not already doing business with the Navy or the DoD. So like those are also good sources. Likewise for the DoD Office of Small Business Programs. And then finally, I would say, you know, like there's joint publications out there. There's Marine Corps doctrine. There's some Navy doctrine things that are accessible to the public. And you know, like that's the Navy in our own words, right? Like that's the Marine Corps in our own words. That's the Joint Force in our own words. When you read those introductory, you know, publications like JP1, you know, it's just, what is joint warfighting? You know, what does it even mean to be a joint warfighter? Those can be, you know, good references as well, because they're usually written for, you know, people in the military, but, you know, people who also need to be schooled up on what's the ontology, you know, what are the abstractions that we care about, you know, what does it mean to be a force generation versus force employment? I mean, there's a lot of sailors out there who are just as confused as the civilians will be until they go through those courses.
Understood. Well, I enjoyed talking with all of you. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to all of this. I would like to thank you, Shannon, and Tammy on the phone for being here. Commander Pine, thank you for coming in and joining us here today. This conversation, we're ending it here. You can continue to put things in Slido. Continue to engage at Naval X with the PEOs and all of the science advisor community that is at ONR. I would say that we start a conversation here. This is not the end of a conversation. Clearly, we have a lot of things we want to work on, things we need to figure out, and we encourage you to join the plan. So, Parker, thank you for making Slido's thing behind the scenes as we're having this conversation, and keep up with us on LinkedIn and Twitter or Slack, and get back to hacking the machine.